Discerning Hearts provides content dedicated to those on the spiritual journey. To continue production of these videos, prayers, and more, go to discerninghearts.com and click the donate link found there or inside the free Discerning Hearts app to make your donation. Thanks, and God bless.
DiscerningHearts.com presents St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty. Father Haggerty is a priest of the Archdiocese of New York who serves at St. Patrick's Cathedral. He taught moral theology and worked as a spiritual director in seminaries for 20 years. He has directed numerous yearly retreats for the Missionaries of Charity. He's the author of Contemplative Provocations, The Contemplative Hunger, Conversion, Contemplative Enigmas, and St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, the book on which this series is based. St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. Welcome again, Father Haggerty.
Thank you, Kris. I'm glad to be back.
There is, I think, the reality that for many people, that this can be a time of just sometimes, a period of suffering. That until that calm comes through, or the peace, or whatever that might be, that in just giving God that time and consistently, or being present or open to that, or even having to die to that, constantly wanting to get something back, that can be a time of suffering, can it?
Well, there's no doubt that prayer has a serious aspect of the losing of self that the gospel asks of us. Many times we think of self-denial or ascetical practices, involving what we do outside with our bodily life, or our sacrificial actions and generous self-giving. But there's a serious aspect of sacrificial life, even of a kind of spiritual asceticism, of self-denial in the interior life of prayer. And it would seem that nobody, goes through life, no real prayer life that's deep and interior, is not going to undergo suffering within. And some of that suffering is it's the suffering of love, that the desire to want, closeness to our Lord, to want to be united with him, and not experiencing this, but experiencing an emptying of self. Not just pure emptiness, but an emptying of other desires that, really do show themselves to be very secondary to the greater pursuit of him alone. So I think, there's no way to persevere in long-term prayer, in some manner, if it's deep interior prayer, without also, having to face trials there. God is asking us then a perseverance in love through that. It's really striking too, to me as a priest, because I did work in seminaries for a long time, spiritual direction with many seminarians over the years, and about 16 years, 20 in all, but 16 years with close relations with seminarians in that manner. And you can see that some get it and many don't. The need for being persevering in prayer when there's no real satisfaction seemingly being given to one's time in prayer. And, in a way, it separates the men from the boys. You have to be able to step up and stay with it, keep at it. Then in time, with perseverance in prayer, that I'm going to pray no matter what. I don't care whether, people are watching or not. People who are serious in their commitment to prayer, at some point, they cross a threshold, and it really does happen. They realize God is very now much at work in their lives, and it has a lasting effect. I think it's like with many things. Once a person crosses a certain threshold, it's unlikely they will give up prayer at that point. But to get there, sometimes is hard. And it's hard because you have to go through, like you said, some suffering for that. And then you realize, well, this is part of the package, and reality and rewards that come are going to be very great from this.
Well, I think that's key to really understand that in this life, people will suffer. We struggle, we have anxieties, we are challenges. All those can be placed under that particular banner. It is part of the human condition. And we don't like to suffer even in our activities, whether it's, we don't like to have a tough job. We don't like to see our kids struggle. We don't, I could go on, the whole myriad, and we want to try to avoid that. In many cases, the intrinsic evil of suffering, we don't desire it. But in some cases, because we've suffered, good things come from that. As a woman who has given birth 3 times, boy, there's suffering. And it's covering, you got to go through that, but there's a great thing that happens. And the reason I emphasize that is that it's the same with prayer, isn't it, Father? I mean, there's going to be these periods. That doesn't mean that you give up on it. You begin to trust the God that says, trust me, and remember the things, remember. And yet that's a very difficult thing, as you said, as your experience with some seminaries. I think that's true with everyone, don't you think?
Well, it's very true. And the problem, though, with prayer, unlike sometimes a job or if we are in a commitment in the priesthood or a marriage, but prayer, serious prayer, can be considered optional. And when it shouldn't be, but a person can walk away from it, or they can treat it as something that, I don't need it to that extent. I think many priests end up in lives that are not that prayerful in the interior life because they never caught, the need for this. So the problem of prayer is you really have to say at some point, I'm going after the high level stakes here. John of the Cross, I see this quote in front of me here from the Ascent of Mount Carmel, which is also in this chapter as I moved on from it. But he will say there in the second book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, from my observations, Christ is little known by those who consider themselves his friends. For we see them going about seeking in him their own consolations and satisfactions, loving themselves very much, but not loving him very much, by seeking his bitter trials and deaths. I am referring to those who believe themselves his friends, not to those who live withdrawn and far away from him. He's tough to read too. I mean, challenging to hear that kind of comment, but it's important in a way if we take John of the Cross seriously, there's no way that a person doesn't advance in their spiritual life if we listen to the importance of things like that. John of the Cross saying, again, in the same section, few there are with the knowledge and desire to enter into the supreme nakedness and emptiness of spirit. This is a venture in which God alone is sought and gained. Thus only God ought to be sought and gained. So there's an element of, I'm not sure, I don't want to exaggerate it, but there's an element of some pain, some trial. Yes, there's pain, trial, suffering that the interior life has to bear, but we also get used to it. I'm sure somebody who runs, these people who run a lot, marathon runners, but a lot of people don't have to be a marathon runner to run, and they like the discipline of doing this day in and day out. And there's painful aspects to it. But far beyond the painful aspect, they are not just staying in shape, so to speak, but there's some satisfaction of the will, giving itself in this. Well, there might be some parallel to that in prayer, that it's not always a pleasant experience, but you're seeking God in prayer. And God inevitably approaches the soul in some manner, sometimes in deep undercurrents of the person, and the layer is underneath awareness. But he doesn't remain blind or inaccessible, literally, to our seeking of him. He responds to those who are serious with him. He surely turns with more of a loving gaze and a personal gaze on those lives.
We'll return to St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty, in just a moment. This is Kris McGregor of Discerning Hearts. a nonprofit Catholic apostolate dedicated to evangelization and spiritual formation through the use of new media. Discerning Hearts creates engaging multimedia specializing in audio and video productions, which are faithful to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and its rich, authentic spiritual tradition. Its mission responds to the Church's call to use the media for evangelization, catechesis, and spiritual renewal. We have made a commitment since the beginning to make the truth shared through Discerning Hearts totally free to users throughout the world. Besides our website, discerninghearts.com, Discerning Hearts has a newly updated free app where users can find all their favorite Discerning Hearts programming, including Father Timothy Gallagher, Dr. Anthony Lillis, Deacon James Keating, Mike Aquilina, Dr. Matthew Bunson, and so many more. There, too, you'll find numerous beautifully produced devotionals and novenas, including the Holy Rosary and Stations of the Cross, to help users create a sacred time for prayer wherever they may be. Discerning Hearts programming can be found on numerous streaming platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and so many more. Discerning Hearts also has an ever-growing YouTube channel. Discerning Hearts online spiritual retreats and seminars have helped souls in North and South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, the Middle East, and the Philippines. For many people all around the world, Discerning Hearts is a daily source of inspiration, spiritual nourishment, and encouragement. We can only do this thanks to the generous financial support of our friends and benefactors. Please consider donating to our mission today. The world is looking for answers, for spiritual guidance and authentic discernment, for relationship and community. Your support is very much needed and appreciated. Please keep our mission in your prayers and tell a friend about Discerning Hearts. We now return to St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty. Yeah, I think the key in a real way, too, is not to try to look at what's happening in somebody else's life. I know we've talked about this, but this is where it really manifests itself. Not to look at the religious experience of other people, whether they're our friends or family members or religious or even saints that we've read about, but to enter into that relationship where we're at, and that will entail whatever the suffering it may be, where we're at. And here we are with Therese. It could be the 1,000 little pinpricks, needle pricks of the day, or the different ways, but suffering then in love, in that, okay, God, I know he's here. I know he's in all this. And so I enter into it. I carry it. Would that be an appropriate way of looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, those are good statements, Kris, and about spiritual life. But what we don't sometimes think of is the realities of these things in the interior life of prayer, if we have, a serious pursuit of interior life of prayer. So, if people are listening to these conversations, there's a question, will I give myself, will I find some time? It's got to be at least, a half hour a day, 20 minutes a day, where I give myself to some silent, private time with God. And if we do that, there is an element there of difficult perseverance, perhaps, that is there in the beginning, will be there as we go on. It's there if we continue in a lifetime of that. But it's also, that's not the primary, reality of this. We are placing ourselves in a much more open relationship with God, and he does respond to that. I think John of the Cross is so valuable, for the interior life in this, because it's the interior life that's very subject to illusion sometimes in the spiritual or religious realm. And we can make misidentifications. We can conceive wrongly what real advancement is. And sometimes real advancement with God is painful. It's a difficult reality. So you get John of the Cross, in that section I was just speaking of from the second book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. This is a very, profound little paragraph that is like pure St. John of the Cross. He says, a genuine spirit, so somebody really, a true person seeking God, a genuine spirit seeks rather the distasteful in God rather than the delectable. They seek this after a while, realizing after a time that walking that path of the cross in some way actually is the much more open door to the real love of God and real experience of his love. The genuine spirit prefers the distasteful in God rather than the delectable. It leans more towards suffering than towards consolation, more toward going without for God than toward possession, toward dryness and affliction than toward sweet consolation. And why? As he goes on, it knows this is the significance of following Christ and denying self, that the other method, so seeking pleasant experiences, that the other method is perhaps a seeking of self in God, something entirely contrary to love. Seeking oneself in God is the same as looking for the caresses and consolations of God. But seeking God in oneself, pure seeking of God, entails not only the desire to do without these consolations for God's sake, but to choose for love of Christ what is most distasteful, what's hard choices, hardship, whether in God or in the world. And much of this comes down to the question of love. What is the real reality of love? And we have to ask the saints, what that is. It's perhaps very contrary to what we humanly, expect of love.
What you were talking about, it sounds like if it's all about me, ultimately. And that's the thing. It's what brings me satisfaction. It might be those experiences in prayer. We experience that too, and are just living out our lives in the world, because it's always that continual seeking of a gratification. Well, we don't want to suffer. So I think that if I consume all these different foods, this is going to somehow make me feel better. But the reality, the truth of it is that I'm just going to need more of it because I become addicted to it, and it's never going to satisfy. It's the same thing with all the other outlets. I can keep doing things, I can keep buying things, but then somehow in the back of my mind, I think I need to have more. And how do I get more? It's that seeking the self. Isn't that the suffering that we don't even realize? And what maybe St. John of the Cross is trying to help us see, that it can inculcate itself so deeply, even in our spiritual life and in our core relationship with God. And that continual seeking for self is like a mushroom cloud that explodes out into all of our activities in the world.
Well said, Kris. And I think what that comes down to is to have in a way, a more sacred respect for the importance of the human will. The reality of sanctity, of holiness, the goal in our life is to be united in our will with the will of God. Everything else in our lives is affected then by that. Our thoughts, what we will pursue, all things. When John of the Cross has a small aphorism saying, deny your desires, and you will find out what your heart longs for. And he's not just saying there, practice self-denial, although that's part of that. Deny your desires, these many things that can give passing satisfactions, pleasures, gratifications. They can be things outside, we can do a lot of good things, but actually we're doing it for ourselves. And deny your desires to feed self, to satisfy self, to gratify, to please, to give some enjoyment, to cease that kind of orientation in one's life. And what does happen? You will find out what your heart is really longing for, which is God. Deep down, a person in a state of grace already has a deep undercurrent, perhaps buried, but an undercurrent of desire for God. If we begin to allow that to be opened up more in our lives, then it's very possible that, our desire for giving to God becomes much more than the orientation, the inclination for satisfaction in our lives. to be able to touch the heart of Jesus in things. But, that statement too is saying something about the interior life of prayer. Deny your desires interiorly, which they might be, a desire for consolation. I desire to feel love. I desire a comfort in prayer. Deny those desires, and you'll find the deeper longing for God that still awaits you. That's the kind of statement that he is, urging on us there.
It's ultimately to trust, isn't it? I know it's going to sound almost paradoxical that if this is what our longing is, you have to let go of it in order to attain it. But that's it's a real thing, as weak as that may sound as I'm saying it, but you have to just let it go, and you got to trust. That's an element that you really can't relinquish, is that trust, can you?
Well, true, but I would also say, when we grow, if we do give ourselves to God, our longing for God is going to crystallize or clarify itself more strongly in our lives. And that is an element that does take place, according to St. John of the Cross, in contemplative graces of prayer, that the will in longing for God is a very real thing, that wanting God, that the undercurrent within the soul of the will, wanting, longing for God, can be very real. And, we don't need to so much let that go as allow the undercurrent of that to flow, within us. That these other things that might have been sought as a longing, some desire of other type of satisfaction, when that kind of drops away and we become more detached from that, the deeper longing of the soul in desire for God, that's where God is gracing. It's like he's putting oil on that flame within the soul when these other things drop away. So that's, yes, we can trust in that, but it's also a reality of prayer. And it's very real that God will draw us more deeply in a inflamed longing for him at deeper layers of the soul, the more we are giving ourselves. And yes, to trust that is going to be happening. We have to believe too that the reality of this, if we're faithful in giving ourselves to him generously outside of prayer, and we're not seeking, these secondary things in prayer that, might be disguised self-seeking.
Well, Father Haggerty, this is such a wonderful insight and a real gift in this conversation on this nature of prayer. I wish we had more time to explore it in this conversation, but in closing, any final thoughts?
I would say sometimes it's good to think about Jesus and his prayer. And it is striking that our Lord, as the incarnate Son of God, went to solitary private prayer. We know that he went to the desert, not just the 40 days in the desert, but he sought times alone, and how much he did that in the years before his public life. And if we, ponder, what was in our Lord's, human will, in his interior heart, when he prayed, surely, deep longing for this union with his Father, the deep desire for him. And, it does strike us when we hear it in the gospel. He says, ask, you will receive. Seek and you will find. Knock, it will be open to you. We should ask for the gift of prayer, the desire for a deeper longing for prayer, the attraction for prayer. And that is surely then a door that opens to more stronger relations with him and pleasing him in our lives.
Thank you so much, Father Haggerty. I'm so grateful for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Kris, for having me and having these conversations with me.
You've been listening to St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty. This series is based on the book St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, published by Ignatius Press. Visit ignatius.com to obtain a copy, or you can find it at any fine Catholic bookstore. To hear and or to download this conversation, along with hundreds of other spiritual formation programs, visit discerninghearts.com, or you can find it within the free Discerning Hearts app. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, which is to offer authentic and rock-solid spiritual formation freely to souls around the world. And if you feel us worthy, consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about discerninghearts.com and join us next time for St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation, with Father Donald Haggerty.